Our fourth speaker today is a man who is in the business of influence. Azeem Azhar founded Peerindex, a social influence analytics company, in 2009. Since then, the company has created Influence Graph, a data set of social media users' influence when it comes to particular topics. Peerindex has also developed influence marketing campaigns for brands including Ford, Virgin Media, and Reebok. And Azeem is a regular industry commentator and investor and advisor to several startups, as well as specializing in consumer internet and disruptive technology. So over to you.
Cool. Right, morning. So I'm Azeem, at Azeem on Twitter. I'm going to get everybody to participate briefly. Nothing too embarrassing. So first, a simple question. How many people here, either for their own company or for a client, look after communities, Facebook pages, internal communities, Twitter, Pinterest? Great. Everyone, what are the rest of you doing here? Okay, can I get a sense, how big are those communities? If it's more than 1 million people, could you put your hands up? Cool. Talk to you later. More than 100,000, but less than 1 million? Okay, so about 5%. So in between 10 and 100K? Okay, so kind of probably half of you here are 10,000 plus people. That's relevant for later. The second question, which is really for my own interest, is so how many of you are using Facebook for your own companies or social clients' social media activities? Okay, so most people. And relative to other platforms, Twitter, Pinterest, whatever else comes up, something you've built yourself, are you going to increase the relative spend and time and investment on Facebook, or decrease it in the next year? So how many of you will increase it? A few. And how many will decrease it? Okay, so it's kind of a split audience. So interesting, I came back from the States a few weeks ago, and to that question of increase versus decrease, asked to about 200 brands, I'd say probably 2/3 put up their hand or said they were going to decrease it relative to the other platforms for the reasons that many of the other previous speakers have talked about. So as an introduction to Peerindex, you may have come across us over the last few years. You know, we're a technology company, and the way to think of us is that if this journey of advocacy is a little bit like an airline that operates flights from London to nice hot destinations, we make the plane, and the agencies and the clients and the social media agencies are the flight crew. So we're useful in kind of fundamentally helping you get your passengers from one place to another, but you're the ones who determine the service quality. You're the ones who make sure the plane leaves on time, that they have a great flight and doesn't fly into a mountain. And it's important, I think, to recognize that. And there are some airlines, Thousand Heads is a good example, who build their own planes. So Thousand Heads have built their own technology because they've been around for a long time. But obviously the market's mature, and then you get companies who come out and say, well, listen, we can help you with particular parts of your problem. And today we're going to talk about one particular area that I think is really important when it comes to thinking about advocacy and a real opportunity for brands. Is this thing working? There you go. So social media is growing up. Before social media, there was Thousand Heads, and after that came social media. And the first thing people did was say, holy, I've got no presence. What do? I need to get followers and I need to get likes. And you'll all remember this 3-4 years ago, the sort of cock swagger at the cocktail party of who had more likes on the page. And I do remember a guy from a big TV network in the States going, and I've got 15 million likes. I'm sure he's not saying that now. And what happens there is that those likes and those followers really are part of an audience that you've grown. But then you get to this moment, which is, what am I going to do with these people? And how am I going to actually build anything useful out of them? And I thought the Volvic example was great, right? Nobody's going to respond to endless pictures of water bottles. So the question is, how do I turn this audience space that I've built into something that is meaningful for my company? And you have to pause a second and look at the history of marketing. The thing that has always been tough for a marketer is to actually get a line of sight relationship with a customer. That's why the media industry, which is where I came from many years ago, existed. Right? The reasons newspaper and TV existed was because Persil found it so damn hard to have a relationship with the buyer of the product. And social media, or digital in general, and other technologies like CRM are transforming that. For the first time, I as a marketer can have a relationship directly to my consumer, and it doesn't need to be mediated by a media company. And that's the case studies that we've heard today, but it is a fundamental shift. And you need to look at it in that historical context and look at it in your daily jobs, like you're literally part of history. Which comes to this point, which is you've got these followers, you've got audiences. How are you going to find out who could be an advocate, who can turn that massive audience into a set of quite meaningful relationships, and ultimately build that bloke with his thumb up? Okay, so I have actually seen these slides before, don't worry. I don't know what's on them. And to look at that, here are some brands, not all of which I use, New Look being one of them, but not because it's not a great retailer, but because I don't shop for clothes. 93,000 followers, 130,000 followers, 750,000 followers on the FT, ESPN, 6 million followers. Now, at some level, there may be noise in there may be junk, there may be spammers. There are audiences in there are people who have actively said they're interested in your brand, they're interested in your content, they could potentially be interested in a relationship if you work that relationship in the right kind of way. And the question is, what are you going to do now? So the thing that we do is answer that now what problem, and to help you find the gold within those audiences or those communities, as we sort of prefer to call them. Because if you can find the gold, we'll talk about what gold means, you can actually start to do meaningful things. If you take this space where you've got all of the people and you've got a subset of them who are your brand's followers, who are your brand's community, within that are going to be people with whom you can have the right kind of relationship. So if you take a technology brand, take a technology brand and you've built up a couple of 100,000 followers. Within that group, you're going to have people who follow that brand who are really actually interested in photography, and some of whom who are interested in music, and some of whom are interested in sport. And they all have a different profile, and they're all going to have a different relevance to the brand when it comes to a particular campaign that you might be running or a particular corporate initiative. And I think the exciting opportunity that we've got today is to align what you do on social media with what the brand's overall goals are. Are we pushing a camera that has high-speed, low-light photography for indoor sports, or are we pushing a camera that's just really practical for parents? And when we look at our undifferentiated group of 200,000 followers, who are the ones in there who are most relevant for us and most relevant for that particular objective? So social data allows us to do that. It allows us to find gold in existing communities. But it also allows us to identify and activate influencers who are maybe inside our community or who might be outside our community. Because let's face it, if you're a technology company, not everybody interested in wildlife photography is going to be following your brand on Twitter or following your Pinterest page. They might live elsewhere, and the abundance of social data makes that possible. As an example, for a company like Peerindex, we look at about 3 billion signals of data a day, and hundreds of gigs of data in order to build a fairly solid map of many parts of the social web. So we can identify people who are influencers, even if they're not following your particular brand. And the last thing that we can start to do is identify new customers and advocates that you didn't even know about, because it's a little bit like having a search engine like Google, which is that you know about a handful of pages, but there are a ton of pages that you don't know about that Google does know about that might be of interest to you. What's going on with this clicker? So what does this gold look like? I'm showing you a slide from a real piece of work we did with a client. This was a company that had in the order of 700,000 followers on Twitter. And this is one particular analysis, and it was about helping them understand who were the people who had the largest reach within that audience so they could figure out if there's anyone they want to engage with. And what was interesting, these are the bands, Peerindex bands, which are numbers from 1 to 100, where Lady Gaga is very high, and so I'm somewhere in the middle, and you know, my cousin is right down the bottom. What's interesting is you tend to focus on those greater than 80 people, and there were 296 of them out of about 600,000. So it's a tiny number. And these were celebrities. These were people like Mike Tyson and Ellen DeGeneres. And they tended to tweet about 3 to 5 times a day. And if you totaled up their combined reach, it was a large number. It was about 110 million. But the reality is that those people are not people that you as a brand could easily on a quotidian basis build a relationship with. They might be somebody who your vice president of business development or CMO could go off to their agency and say, should we do something, Mike? But they're not going to be things that we're going to do on the front line. What became interesting, though, is those 2 segments below, who we call the must-knows and the troopers in the green. So these are people who are relatively active on social media. And you know, the greens, the must-knows, 18 tweets a day, so they're active on social. I mean, they're going to spend several hours a day connected to Twitter in this case, with a combined reach of 47 million people across that group. Interestingly enough, it's 5,500. So people, 1,800 plus, you know, 3,700. And if you think about what we've done with the problem, we've taken a problem of 600,000 followers on Twitter. That is a big number. If it takes you 3 minutes to figure out who each one of those people are, if you're an agency, that's a massive bill you're going to send to your clients, which might be a good thing, or they might just say, I'm never going to pay for that. But by the time we bring that down to 5,500, you've actually got a much more manageable task of figuring out who in this is likely to be somebody you want to build a relationship with. And the reason that's important is because in order to get up to those higher tiers of 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, somebody has to have built a reputation. They have to have been regularly and demonstrably producing content that other people are engaging with. And what we often see happen when companies run competitions on Facebook is that, or indeed on Twitter, is that a vast number of the entries from competitions come in from people who don't even register on the graph. Right? They're absolute neophytes. Now that's interesting. You know, it's great that somebody's interested in your company. But if your goal is around advocacy, building, and influence, you really need to spend your time with the people who actually might have a chance of having some influence rather than those who don't have any audience at all. But it's also important to say that influence is a very, very layered thing, and it's not really about a single score. And I know that a lot of people look at companies like ours and companies like Cred and Clout and say, well, there's a single number here. What is this all about? And you know, the reality is that when you're putting out consumer products, you often want to make them as simple as you can. But it's a little bit like a hospital like St. Mary's, which has a gift shop in the front. And if you just walk into the first lobby, you'll think, oh, this is a gift shop. This place sells newspapers and bunnies and flowers. But it's actually not a gift shop, it's a hospital. And if you go into the lifts and go up to the bottom, you'll find your orthopedic surgeons and your cardiologists and your radiologists. I think it's really important to recognize that behind the single scores that are produced for consumers to understand what we do, there's a tremendous amount of depth and layering. In our case, we talk very heavily about topics because it's very important that if you're trying to understand a particular community, you know the things that they care about. Do they care about sports, or do they care about football, or do they care about Chelsea rather than flower arranging or ice skating? Context becomes really interesting. So I'll give you an example from a client we did some work with, where we were able to, they had these 600,000 followers, and they had people like Mike Tyson and Ellen DeGeneres in that community of the 600,000. These are people with huge reach. I think Ellen has 17 million followers on Twitter. But if you then actually graphed that community and said who within that community actually engages and affects other people in that community, you got a completely different list. Because of course your inside influencers are not your celebrities. Your inside influencers are people who resonate very closely to the values and the content of that community, and it's a different group. So that's one area of context. Another area of context was to say, well, we've got this community of 600,000 people. Now, who are the people who actually are not in the community who most impact the people inside my community? because those people are quite interesting as well. And again, you've got 600,000 people. When we put this together for that particular client, there were 500 million edges and something like 28 million people who had engaged with the 600,000 in question. So you can manually walk through that if you want to. Or our tool will come out and say, well, here are the top 50,000 of those 28 million, and here's what they talk about. And here are the ones that you might want to go and do some further research in. Because the critical thing is that the audiences are getting very, very large. I was super impressed that Nokia have got 200,000 people in their advocacy program, because that is the start of the scale that you should be getting to. You know, if your advocates are 1% of the population, that in the UK is 600,000 people already. That is the kind of scale that advocacy needs to get to, and you'll only get to that scale when you have technology to help you. And today what we're starting is some companies, Nokia, 200,000 advocates, fantastic. Many companies are still at the 10, 20, 50 advocacy level. And the problem is with that, unless you're a small emerging brand like a meat licker, you're never going to move any metric. Now, if you're doing an advocacy program in a category like Tide, which is a detergent in the States and sells billions of dollars, having 11 advocates is simply not going to increase your NPS or your market share. Having 11 celebrities or past presidents of the US might help you, but that's completely different. Right, so advocacy programs are going to have to get very, very much bigger, and in order to manage the scale, just in terms of the identification and the predictability, and then the measurement, you're going to have to use technology. And they're only going to get bigger once you can start to show demonstrable returns to what you do, which means systems and processes, as opposed to pure flashes of genius and inspiration. So there's a close relationship between companies like us who make the planes and who are into the technology and allow you to scale, and agencies who are building know-how, intellectual property, and process that takes the risk out of actually working in this place. But that's the virtuous circle that will then unleash what we think will become 6 to 7% of marketing spend in the next 4 or 5 years. How are we doing for time?
Just a few more minutes.
Just a few more minutes, okay. Yeah, sure, I'm happy. So I have to always put a picture of Jordan in these presentations just to say, obviously, we know it's not about celebrity. You know, 92% of consumers trust earned media above other forms of advertising. I put that one in because it's really interesting the way that Nielsen think about that. Right? Other forms of advertising implies that earned media is a form of advertising, which implies that the conversation that you have with your gran at Christmas about the nice jumper she bought you is a form of advertising. So there's kind of something wrong with that picture in the first place, but that 92% is a nice. And nor is it about hamsters or follow accounts, but I think we're all beyond the world of follow accounts. Although I do want to ask a question, and you can cover your eyes if you don't want to embarrass yourselves. How many people here have a KPI to increase the number of likes? Okay, and how about increasing the number of followers on Twitter? Yeah, a few. Yeah, did anybody have that as a KPI in the last couple of years, either of those? Yeah, more people. So, you know, it was just because as managers, right, managers need simple numbers. They don't have enough time. And I think we're now moving beyond that point where hopefully what you'll be able to deliver to people to managers is some kind of metric that's related to brand alignment, or some kind of metric that's related to net promoter score, or as Warren points out, cash coming into the business. I've talked about this already. So I'll talk about a couple of things that we did that were interesting in terms of generating some word of mouth, and the start of what both Thousand Heads and We Are Social called as of the relation to the advocacy journey. So we helped Ford push out the start of a campaign around a car called the B-Max. So they had a pretty big integrated campaign around the B-Max, and we were one part of that, which was really the first troops off onto the battlefield to get ordinary people who were interested in technology and design talking about this car and aware of the car. But it was really more a function. What's interesting here is of the scale at which we were able to to operate. So for BMAX, what they wanted to do was identify influencers that were in the area of technology, design, and architecture in 6 European markets, so working in 6 languages. And all they needed to do at this stage, at this first point of the campaign, which had many other layers to it, was get people to know about the BMAX and get people to think about it in terms of innovation. And what we were able to do was look at an index of a couple of 100 million people and identify in the order of 450 to 500,000 across these 6 markets who frequently talked about those particular attributes: technology, design, architecture. And then within that group, identify 25,000 people in the right influence tier. So not the super celebrities, not the Jeremy Clarksons, not the Charles Arthurs at the Guardians, but a tier of people that's probably similar to people in these rooms, right? The friends of yours who always queue up to get the iPad or the Samsung outside the store. And then help them activate them with the first drop of a piece of content. Now, what's interesting about that process is at the front end that we did, the research piece and the 25,000 influencers being identified and which 700 you go after, is a piece where technology plays a really, really deep role. Where human expertise and agencies play a role is figuring out what the message should be, how that should work, what the follow-up should be, what the next stage in the journey ought to be. We have another case study, but I'll just skip that for now. So if you'd like to keep in touch, email addresses, websites, and Twitter handles up there. Thank you.
Great stuff. Thanks, Azeem. Thank you. Thanks very much, Azeem.